Hey everyone, and thanks for joining me virtually. My talk today is entitled A Revised and Expanded Taxonomy for Understanding Heterogeneity in Research and Reporting Practices. This is work that I've been doing in collaboration with Samantha Anderson and Michael Edwards. So here's an overview of what I'll talk about today. I'll start with some background, focusing on the intersection of replication and psychometrics. I'll talk a little bit about researcher degrees of freedom and questionable research practices, which form the basis of our proposed taxonomy. I'll give a conceptual example of how our taxonomy helps with evaluation of research and reporting practices, highlight some taxonomy goals, and then finish with limitations and future directions. So, replication and psychometrics. With the exception of a few studies, psychometrics has been largely overlooked in the replication literature. And to my knowledge, no studies have focused on factor analysis specifically, which is a widely used and popular measurement model in psychology. Yet, many studies depend on the soundness of psychological measures, which stresses the importance of understanding replication in psychometrics. Substandard measurement could affect and threaten study inferences and conclusions. So the big question for me was, do factor analyses replicate? I found issues with replicating factor structures across studies that analyze the same scale. Particularly, I've looked at the brief self-control scale, the BSCS, the CESD, the depression scale, and then the NEO, the personality scale, which are all widely used scales in psychological research. And there's been disagreement about factor structure across studies that have looked at these scales. If the answers regarding psychometric properties change from study to study, can we trust the measurements? To begin answering this question, my collaborators and I turned to the replication literature more broadly to search for a framework that could be used to evaluate replication in factor analysis. So, high failure rates for replication have been observed across many scientific fields, also referred to as the replication crisis. Here are a couple examples here, chemistry, biology, physics, etc. These concerns about failures to replicate can be partially recast as concerns about excessive heterogeneity in research results. So if research results are changing from study to study, can we trust it? So although some heterogeneity is reasonable to expect, for example, there's sampling error, differences due to studying different populations, and a lot of work recently has been done on moderators, some hidden and some not hidden. Reducing excess heterogeneity is desirable. So we submit that there are avoidable sources of heterogeneity, and these sources unnecessarily obscure similarities or dissimilarities across results, which will weaken trust and stall progress. So when possible, the goal should be to diminish these sources of avoidable heterogeneity to obtain a more accurate impression across a series of results. So in the meta-science literature, researcher degrees of freedom, or RDFs, and questionable research practices, QRPs, have been common terms for describing methodological flexibility. These terms are coined independently and not meant to be directly compared, but they're used somewhat interchangeably. Both of them have the potential to inject avoidable heterogeneity into a series of research results. So our search for a framework to evaluate replication and factor analysis revealed a need to refine some of the language used to talk about replication more generally. In particular, there's an opportunity to clarify and distinguish between RDFs and QRPs. So they're used somewhat interchangeably, but we have a lot to gain from distinguishing between the two terms. This distinction is the basis of the taxonomy that we've developed to more effectively and efficiently evaluate research practices. And eventually, we hope to use this taxonomy for an evaluation of factor analysis. So we revised the definitions. Typically, RDFs describe choices among acceptable methodological alternatives. QRPs, on the other hand, tend to describe choices that stray from best practices. So building off this qualitative difference that we found in the literature of QRPs being substandard compared to RDFs, we propose more precise definitions that depend on the weight of evidence for or against a research practice. So our revised definition of RDFs is a set of viable or supported research practices, and our revised definition for QRPs are research practices that are known to be wrong or suboptimal. So there are three caveats with this categorization of RDF or QRP. The first one is the categorization is often dependent on context. So it may change from situation to situation. Number two, it may change in light of new research. So as more methodological work is done, something that was once an RDF may become a QRP. And then number three, it does not solely depend on the severity of impact on results. So even though something is suboptimal and a QRP does not automatically mean that the impact on results will be severe. Sometimes QRPs have no effect on the results, but that's not part of how we're deciding to categorize between an RDF or a QRP. So our proposed taxonomy expands on this RDF-QRP distinction. It is a revision and an extension of the SYNEC framework for defining research practices. In the SYNEC framework, there is responsible conduct of research, which represents ideal behavior. There is fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism, which represents worst behavior. And then there are QRPs, which fall somewhere in between ideal and worst behavior. So in other words, QRPs fall in between responsible conduct of research and fabrication, falsification, and plagiarism. So our taxonomy includes separate frameworks for research and reporting practices. So one for research practices and then another for reporting practices. And then the first thing that we do is we reorganize the SYNEC framework to align with this research reporting split. We do exclude plagiarism from the taxonomy, and I'll describe that more later. Okay, so here's our proposed taxonomy with the SYNEC framework placed within it. So you'll see that I have some blanks here. And what I'll do throughout the presentation is I'll begin to build out the taxonomy, and that will fill in the blanks that we have. Okay, so again, we have research practices here on the left, reporting practices here on the right. And then from the SYNEC framework, we have responsible conduct of research, which is ideal. We have fabrication and falsification, which is the worst behavior, according to the SYNEC framework. And then we've dropped plagiarism. And then somewhere in between, or that's where SYNEC placed it, we have questionable research practices. Okay, so starting with the framework for research practices. So for responsible conduct of research, we define this as research practices that meet the highest standards of research ethics, moral principles, and research integrity / professional standards. And there are two types in our taxonomy. The first one is the single best option, or SBO, and this is a practice that the evidence suggests is optimal in all situations. So this is the option that should be chosen if it exists. On the other hand, we have RDFs, which we define as a set of empirically supported practices. So what should be chosen is a bit ambiguous. So for SBOs, it's one clear choice, and then for RDFs, there are multiple choices that could work, which makes the choice a bit unclear. And then we also have QRPs, which are practices that lack empirical support or evidence weighs against their use. So these are options that should not be chosen. So putting these into our taxonomy, this is where we left off. So we have responsible conduct of research, which we'll be filling in with the single best option, and then researcher degrees of freedom. Okay, so framework for reporting practices. Practices are first differentiated on the basis of fraud. So this is the intentional perversion of truth and the act of deceiving or misrepresenting. Fraud encompasses fabrication and falsification from the SYNEC framework. So to constitute as fraud, there must be an attempt to purposefully mask a QRP. So we define fabrication as making up data or results and failing to disclose doing so with the intent of deceiving or misrepresenting. And similarly, falsification is changing data or results and failing to disclose doing so with the intent of deceiving or misrepresenting. So this is always an issue of reporting because it obscures the truth and does not allow the reader, replicator, or reviewer to accurately evaluate research practices. So fraud will always be in reference to a QRP. And a note here that fixing the fraud, though, will not fix the QRP. These are related but separate issues. So here's the part on why we excluded plagiarism. And so plagiarism is also a form of fraud, but it is not included in our taxonomy because unlike the other elements of our taxonomy, plagiarism does not have the ability to influence quantitative results. So plagiarism is excluded because of the lack of potential impact on results, but this is not meant to suggest that it's acceptable. All right, so here we have our taxonomy again. And so we'll be filling in here, fabrication and falsification fall under fraudulent. Okay, and then here we have honest. So this is for reporting. While fraud always involves issues of reporting, not all reporting issues carry the intent to deceive. So if reporting is not fraudulent, then reporting is either complete and correct, incomplete or incorrect, or both incomplete and incorrect. So cases of incomplete and or incorrect reporting may signal an opportunity to more clearly convey or enforce best practices for reporting. And here we provide some references for methods checklists, which could be helpful, and since it's standardized guidance on how to report different kinds of things, from transparency to quantitative research in general to structural equation modeling to measurement. Okay, so now we'll fill in the rest of the taxonomy here. So this arm here that is not fraudulent is honest reporting, and we can have complete and correct, incomplete or incorrect, and incomplete and incorrect. All right, so I'm going to go through a conceptual example. Here we have a table where we've compiled a list of different research practices in the RDFQRP literature, and we have the practices here, the original classification here, how it was classified in the original paper, and then we have the new classification here. So we developed this taxonomy to allow for more effective evaluations of research and reporting practices. Our new classifications may agree with, replace, or add nuance to original classifications, and the goal is to help minimize ambiguity and ultimately avoidable heterogeneity. So eventually, we plan to use this taxonomy to answer our original question, do factor analyses replicate? And so I'll walk through a conceptual example here of how we can use our taxonomy to more effectively evaluate research and reporting practices. Okay, so the first example is choosing sample size. This one remains an RDF because there's more than one viable approach to selecting sample size. However, failing to conduct sample size planning for primary data collection would be considered a QRP. And so in this case, we agree with the original classification. In this case, we would replace the original classification. So this example is withholding details of methodology or results in papers or proposals. We change this to incomplete reporting. Although this practice is questionable and justifiably classified as a QRP initially, the issue with this practice is more precisely about incomplete reporting because the information is omitted. And a note here that omissions may also be attempts to cover up a QRP. And then here is an example where we add nuance with our new taxonomy. So with practices 8 through 11, they're reclassified as conditional RDF/QRPs. For example, choosing among dependent variables. This was originally classified as an RDF, and if selection is a priori and based on theory or measurement quality, this practice remains an RDF. But it becomes a QRP if selection is based solely on statistical significance. And then an additional advantage is practices 3 through 5 all describe optional stopping rules for data collection. So this is where data collection either stops if a statistical test yields significance or continues until significance is obtained. This is known to inflate type 1 error rates. So practices 3 through 5 all describe the same practice. So despite the consistent descriptions, each paper had a different classification. One described it as a QRP, another as p-hacking, and another as an RDF. Our proposed taxonomy resolves this inconsistency and makes it clear, given the evidence of inflating type 1 error rates, that optional stopping is a QRP and should be avoided. Okay, so that's the conceptual example. And here I'll go over some of the goals of our taxonomy. So our hope is for the proposed taxonomy to achieve the following goals. Number 1, help researchers understand the different sources of heterogeneity across studies. Number 2, provide a structure for organizing and evaluating research and reporting practices that contribute to avoidable heterogeneity. 3, help researchers navigate the complex series of decisions made among acceptable and unacceptable practices throughout the research process. And finally, number 4, drive research toward domains where more methodological guidance is needed. As for limitations, many practices do not fit neatly into one of the taxonomy classifications. Some research practices contain elements of reporting practices and vice versa, and this can blur how to best classify a practice. Other researchers may disagree with one or more of our classifications or may disagree with one another. This next one is pretty important. However, our taxonomy was not developed to solve all ambiguity associated with methodological flexibility, but to increase clarity and provide a productive framework in which to situate these discussions. So just to highlight this, our taxonomy was developed to initiate discussions about things related to methodological flexibility, which in effect will have an impact on hopefully replication issues, but it was not designed to be a catch-all solution for things that are preventing studies from being replicated. And then for future directions, we hope to see the use of our taxonomy extended and tailor fit to specialty areas, such as psychometrics, could be useful for guiding sensitivity analyses. And we hope this taxonomy, we hope that future work will articulate how this framework can help direct methodological research. So in conclusion, our proposed taxonomy is broadly applicable to replication issues across a variety of methodological areas. We have demonstrated the use of this taxonomy to better understand heterogeneity related to design, analysis, and reporting. And we hope that this taxonomy facilitates a more productive discussion of these issues for both methodologists and applied researchers, which we hope will make further contributions to the greater discussion on replicability. So that's all I have for my talk today. Thank you so much for joining me virtually. Thanks for your time. And here to close, I have a picture of my wife and I's 2 dogs. We have Telly here on the left. She's our small little Maltipoo, and then we have Apache here on the right. Again, thank you all, and look forward to the live session July 22nd.